The taste of copper had been sitting on my tongue for 3 days, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't coming from the old pipes in my clinic. Something metallic and bitter had settled into the air itself, coating everything with an atmosphere that made my skin crawl and my hands tremble when I reached for even the most routine medical instruments. I'm Dr. Clara Wynn, and I've been running this small-town veterinary practice for 12 years, long enough to trust my instincts when they're screaming that something is fundamentally wrong. The morning I first laid eyes on Pilgrim, those instincts were louder than they'd ever been, not warning me away from danger, but pulling me toward a mystery that would challenge everything I thought I knew about the boundaries between medicine and something far more terrifying. The call had come from the county animal shelter on a Tuesday morning that felt heavier than weather patterns could explain. A dog had been found behind the abandoned St. Augustine Chapel on Route 12, sitting perfectly still among the broken concrete and weeds that had claimed the building's foundation. He hadn't run when approached, hadn't shown any of the typical fear responses of a stray animal. He'd simply sat there, watching the approaching animal control officer with an expression that the man described as too knowing for comfort. They'd named him Pilgrim at the shelter, though nobody could explain why that particular word had come to mind. The intake coordinator said it just felt right, like the name belonged to him already. When I first saw him in the transport kennel, I understood what she meant. There was something deliberately patient about his bearing, something that suggested he was on a journey with specific purpose rather than simply surviving day to day. Before I tell you what I discovered about Pilgrim's refusal to eat, I need to know something. Can you tell me in the comments where you're watching from? Your country? Your city? Sometimes when I'm dealing with cases that challenge every assumption I've made about animal behavior and medical science, I wonder if there are others out there who've encountered mysteries that textbooks simply can't explain. Pilgrim was a lean, medium-sized mixed breed, with a coat that looked like he'd been rolling in ash and soot. Not the surface dirt you'd expect from a stray living rough, but something deeper, as if the gray-black residue had been worked into his fur at the molecular level. His eyes were the color of winter ice, pale blue and startlingly intelligent, but they held an age that seemed incompatible with his physical appearance. He couldn't have been more than 3 or 4 years old, but his gaze carried the weight of something much older. What disturbed me immediately wasn't his appearance, though, but his absolute stillness. Most animals arriving at veterinary clinics display stress behaviors, panting, pacing, seeking comfort, or trying to hide. Pilgrim lay in his kennel with the composed resignation of someone who had accepted whatever fate awaited him, neither seeking attention nor avoiding it. But there was something deliberate about his passivity, something that felt more like choice than defeat. The refusal to eat began immediately and continued with unwavering consistency. For 3 full days, he hadn't touched a single morsel of food or even lapped water from his bowl. I'd tried everything in my considerable arsenal of techniques for encouraging appetite in stressed animals. Warmed chicken breasts that usually tempted even the most reluctant patients, fresh beef liver with its irresistible aroma, hand-feeding approaches that created personal connection and trust. Nothing worked. Pilgrim would acknowledge the offered food with what seemed like recognition, sometimes even lean forward as if considering it, but then settle back into his watchful stillness without taking a bite. There was no fear in his refusal, no indication that trauma was preventing him from eating. Instead, there was intention, conscious choice, as if he understood something about consumption that made it dangerous in ways I couldn't fathom. My initial medical examination revealed results that should have been reassuring, but somehow felt more ominous. His vital signs were perfect: temperature precisely within normal range, heart rate steady and strong, respiratory function excellent. Blood work came back clean across every parameter I tested. Abdominal palpation revealed no obstructions, no signs of gastrointestinal distress or dysfunction that might explain his refusal to eat. But when I placed my stethoscope against his chest to listen to his heart, something made me pause and listen more carefully. Not an irregularity in the cardiac rhythm itself, but something surrounding it. A subtle secondary sound, like an echo bouncing off surfaces that shouldn't exist. I'd never encountered anything like it in 15 years of veterinary practice, and the sound made my hands shake as I tried to isolate and identify its source. That first evening, driven by instincts I couldn't name, I stayed late at the clinic to observe Pilgrim's behavior during the quiet hours when stress levels typically decreased. As the sun set and the building settled into its after-hours stillness, I found myself sitting on the floor beside his kennel, speaking to him in the gentle voice I used with frightened animals. "What are you trying to tell me?" I whispered into the growing darkness. Pilgrim turned his head toward me with deliberate slowness, and something in his pale eyes made me instinctively step back. It wasn't fear I saw there, but warning. Not the kind of warning that suggests an animal might bite or flee, but something deeper, as if he was trying to communicate urgent information that I needed to understand before circumstances moved beyond anyone's control. And if stories like this move your heart the way they move mine, make sure you subscribe, so you don't miss what happened when I discovered the truth about what Pilgrim was protecting us from. Because what I found inside his body would challenge everything I thought I knew about the boundaries between the natural and the impossible. Moments after that silent exchange, the power cut out completely. Not the gradual dimming of an overloaded circuit or the brief flicker of a routine fluctuation, but an instantaneous, total blackout that plunged the clinic into absolute darkness. Emergency lighting clicked on automatically, casting eerie shadows through the corridors and creating an atmosphere that felt charged with anticipation. I hurried toward the electrical panel to diagnose what I assumed was a mechanical failure, my footsteps echoing strangely in the altered acoustics of the emergency-lit building. But when I turned back toward Pilgrim's area, my blood turned to ice water in my veins. His kennel door was standing wide open, though I distinctly remembered checking the latch during my evening rounds. Pilgrim was no longer inside the enclosure, but I could see him at the far end of the hallway, sitting perfectly erect and staring at the wall with an intensity that suggested he was perceiving something invisible to my eyes. He wasn't barking or showing any signs of agitation. He was simply waiting, like a sentinel maintaining vigil over something that required his absolute attention. The silence was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat, and beneath that, something else. That same subliminal echo I detected with the stethoscope, now audible in the ambient air around him. The next morning, I made the decision to sedate Pilgrim for comprehensive imaging. His behavior had moved beyond unusual into territory that demanded deeper investigation, and my medical training insisted that understanding his physical condition might provide clues to his psychological state. The X-rays and ultrasound equipment hummed to life as I prepared him for procedures that I hoped would provide answers rather than deepening the mystery. The results changed everything I thought I knew about what was possible within the realm of veterinary medicine. Beneath Pilgrim's ribcage, nestled just behind his stomach in an anatomical position that should have been occupied by normal organ tissue, was something that defied every classification system I'd ever studied. Not mechanical like an implanted device, not biological like a tumor or parasitic growth, but something that existed in the liminal space between categories. A structure too geometrically perfect to be natural, wrapped in what appeared to be a membranous casing that pulsed in perfect synchronization with his breathing. The object wasn't growing or deteriorating. It simply existed, dormant but somehow vital, integrated into his anatomy with surgical precision that suggested intelligence far beyond current medical capabilities. Most disturbing was the network of neural pathways surrounding it, nerve clusters that had been deliberately rerouted to accommodate its presence, as if his entire nervous system had been modified to support whatever function this thing served. I stared at the monitor for nearly an hour, adjusting image contrast and magnification, hoping to find some logical explanation for what I was seeing. But there was no denying the evidence displayed in stark detail across multiple imaging modalities. This wasn't the result of injury or illness or accidental ingestion. This was design. Intentional, sophisticated, purposeful design implemented by intelligence that possessed capabilities I couldn't begin to understand. That evening, compelled by growing certainty that Pilgrim's discovery hadn't been coincidental, I researched everything available about St. Augustine Chapel and the surrounding area. Most historical records had been lost when the county courthouse burned in the 1970s, but satellite imagery revealed details that made my chest tighten with recognition. Carved into the stone floor of the chapel's nave, clearly visible from aerial photographs taken during restoration surveys in the 1990s, was a spiral pattern approximately 10 feet in diameter. The design was geometrically complex, composed of interlocking curves that seemed to flow into each other with mathematical precision. The spiral was identical to one I'd seen in a dream 3 nights earlier. A vivid, unsettling vision of walking through corridors lined with symbols I couldn't read, following the sound of breathing that wasn't quite human. I'd dismissed it as anxiety-induced nightmare, but seeing that pattern etched in stone convinced me that my subconscious was processing information my rational mind couldn't yet accept. I wasn't alone in this discovery. Whatever force had guided Pilgrim to that abandoned chapel, whatever intelligence had designed the object inside his body, had also orchestrated our meeting. The realization should have been terrifying, but instead, I felt a strange sense of inevitability, as if pieces of a puzzle I didn't know I was solving had finally begun clicking into place. If you're feeling this moment the way I did when it happened, please leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. It means more than you know, because what happened next would convince me that some mysteries choose their witnesses, and not everyone is prepared for the responsibility that comes with forbidden knowledge. The pattern extended beyond simple coincidence. Research into the chapel's history revealed fragments of information that painted a disturbing picture of the building's original purpose. Built in 1847 by a religious sect that had broken away from mainstream Christianity, St. Augustine's had served as both place of worship and center for what historical documents euphemistically described as theological experimentation. The sect's leader, a man named Ezra Blackwood, had claimed direct communication with divine forces that provided knowledge unavailable through conventional religious channels. His followers believed that spiritual evolution required integration of physical and metaphysical elements, that the human form could be enhanced to serve as a bridge between earthly existence and higher realms of consciousness. Church records from the period, preserved in the State Historical Society's archives, contained references to vessels of translation and guardians of passage, terminology that made my hands shake as I read by lamplight in my clinic's office. The final entry, dated just days before the chapel was abandoned, mentioned the completion of the first integration and preparation for the Watcher's return. But it was what I found in my own dreams that convinced me the connection between Pilgrim and the chapel went deeper than geographical coincidence. Every night since his arrival, I'd been experiencing visions that felt more like memories than subconscious projections. I walked through the chapel's interior as it had existed more than a century ago, observing ceremonies conducted by robed figures around the spiral pattern carved in the floor. Animals were brought forward, not for sacrifice, but for some kind of blessing or transformation that involved placing them at the center of the spiral, while complex incantations were spoken in languages I didn't recognize. And always, in these dream memories, I saw the same pale blue eyes watching from the shadows around the chapel's perimeter. Eyes that belonged to creatures that looked like dogs, but moved with intelligence that transcended animal consciousness. Guardians waiting for their assigned moment to fulfill purposes that spanned generations. The real test came on the 4th night of Pilgrim's stay, when autumn wind howled around the clinic's walls and the emergency lighting flickered intermittently, as if responding to electrical fields I couldn't detect. For the first time since his arrival, Pilgrim moved independently from his kennel, walking with purposeful steps to the large window that faced northeast toward the abandoned chapel. He positioned himself in perfect alignment with something I couldn't see, sitting with military precision while his entire body trembled with suppressed energy. And for the first time in 4 days, I saw genuine fear in his pale eyes. Not fear of me or the clinic or the strange environment he'd found himself in, but primal terror directed at something approaching from a direction only he could perceive. His refusal to eat suddenly made perfect sense with crystalline clarity that left me breathless with understanding. Pilgrim wasn't protecting himself from contaminated food or responding to trauma-induced appetite loss. He was protecting us, the clinic, the town, perhaps the entire world, from whatever was contained within the object in his chest. Eating would provide the metabolic energy needed for that thing to activate, to complete whatever purpose it had been designed to serve across the decades or centuries since its implantation. His hunger was a sacrifice. His starvation a form of heroism that kept something terrible from awakening. The question wasn't why he wouldn't eat. It was how long he could continue refusing before his body's survival instincts overrode his conscious resistance, and what would happen to all of us when that moment finally came. I began leaving offerings that night. Not food that would trigger activation, but electrolyte solutions and vitamin supplements that might sustain him without providing the specific nutritional components the object required. Pilgrim accepted these minimal nutrients with grateful acknowledgement, as if he understood that I was trying to help him maintain his vigil without compromising his mission. But even as I worked to support his resistance, I could see the toll his sacrifice was taking. His body weight dropped steadily, his coat lost its luster, and his movements became increasingly careful as his energy reserves dwindled. Most heartbreaking was the expression in his eyes, not just physical exhaustion, but the spiritual weariness of someone carrying a burden too heavy for any single creature to bear. Late at night, when I sat beside him in the darkened clinic, listening to that almost subliminal humming that seemed to emanate from the object in his chest, I began to understand that we were fighting a losing battle. The thing inside him was patient, but not dormant. It was gathering strength from sources I couldn't identify, preparing for activation whether Pilgrim cooperated or not. Sometimes I could feel it pulsing in harmony with rhythms that had nothing to do with his biological functions. Cosmic cycles, perhaps, or the movement of celestial bodies that influenced forces beyond human comprehension. Each pulse seemed stronger than the last, more insistent, building toward some kind of culmination that approached with astronomical inevitability. During those long vigils, Pilgrim would occasionally turn his head to look directly at me. And in those moments I felt the weight of communication that transcended species barriers. He was trying to prepare me for something, passing along knowledge that couldn't be expressed in words but had to be experienced, absorbed, integrated at levels deeper than conscious understanding. I dreamed of the spiral in the chapel floor opening like a doorway, of robed figures emerging from dimensions that existed parallel to our own, of transformations that bridged the gap between what we call reality and what we fear to acknowledge exists beyond it. And always, in these visions, Pilgrim stood guard at the threshold, holding back forces that waited just beyond perception for their moment to cross over. The children began appearing on the 7th day of his stay. Not the usual parade of young people bringing injured pets or accompanying parents to routine appointments, but something different. Kids who stood outside the clinic's windows for hours, not seeking entry, but simply maintaining presence. They ranged in age from perhaps 5 to 15, arriving independently and positioning themselves at equal intervals around the building's perimeter. They didn't speak to each other or to the adults who occasionally asked what they were doing there. They simply watched, their attention focused on the section of the building where Pilgrim maintained his own vigil. When I approached the windows to observe them more closely, several of the younger children would place their palms against the glass, and I swear I could feel vibrations through the barrier. Not sound, but some kind of energy transmission that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. One afternoon, a girl who couldn't have been more than 8 years old knocked on the clinic's front door. When I opened it, she looked up at me with eyes that seemed far too serious for her age and said, "The dog is getting tired. He can't hold it much longer." "Hold what?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer would be something I wasn't prepared to hear. "The door," she replied with the matter-of-fact certainty that children sometimes possess. "He's keeping the door closed, but it wants to open. And when it does, everything will be different." She turned and walked away before I could ask any follow-up questions, rejoining the silent circle of watchers who maintained their posts until sunset, and then dispersed to their homes, only to return the next morning to resume their patient observation. On the 10th day, Pilgrim finally accepted food. I found him in the morning standing over his bowl, having consumed every morsel of the high-calorie nutritional paste I'd left for him the night before. His physical condition had improved dramatically overnight, coat regaining its luster, eyes bright with renewed energy, movements fluid and purposeful rather than careful and conserved. But the change in his behavior was what filled me with dread that sat like ice in my stomach. For the first time since his arrival, Pilgrim was restless. He paced his kennel with measured steps, pausing occasionally to stare at points in the air where nothing visible existed. The subliminal humming that had characterized his presence grew stronger, more complex, developing harmonics and overtones that seemed to resonate through the building's structural elements. And outside, the children increased their numbers. What had begun as perhaps a dozen watchers grew to 30, then 50, then more than I could count accurately. They maintained their silent vigil with the dedication of guards, protecting something sacred, their young faces serious with responsibility that no child should have to carry. That night, as I prepared to leave the clinic, Pilgrim did something he'd never done before. He walked directly to me, sat down, and placed his front paws on my legs. When I looked into his pale blue eyes, I saw not the patient endurance that had characterized our relationship, but urgent communication that bypassed language entirely. He was saying goodbye, not because he was leaving, but because he was about to become something else entirely. The object in his chest had absorbed enough energy to begin its transformation sequence, and the dog I'd come to know was about to be replaced by something that served purposes I couldn't comprehend, but was clearly not meant for this world. I understood then that my role hadn't been to heal Pilgrim or solve the mystery of his condition. I'd been chosen as witness to something that required documentation, as guardian of knowledge that would be needed when others like him began appearing in locations around the world. The responsibility felt heavier than I'd ever imagined, but somehow I knew that refusing it wasn't an option. Some mysteries choose their storytellers, and some truths require witnesses brave enough to bear testimony even when the evidence challenges everything we think we know about reality. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this story. If it touched you, please subscribe, leave your comment below, and know how grateful I am for having you here. Because some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. And sometimes the greatest courage isn't in solving mysteries, but in standing guard while they unfold according to purposes larger than any single life can contain.